Welcome back to this afternoon session of EconPol 2021. We are set to dive straight into the topic that's been top of mind for policymakers around the world, not just here in Europe, with its implications for investment, employment, digital transformation, shaping climate policy and redistribution of wealth, all that you heard of and about in our first session and our first debate as well. But this morning, the EconPol paper authored by Daniel Gros, the director of the Center for European Policy Studies, titled High Public Debt in an Uncertain World, the Post-COVID-19 Dangers for Public Finance, was released. Again, Daniel's angle is quite different, as we've pointed out in our earlier sessions, that from what Mr. Olivier Blanchard had to say. I'm, of course, talking about the dangers of high public debt in what is, we all know, a very uncertain world. And we've established that there are two schools of thought on this and how to tackle it. But it's going to be a massive issue that's going to come home to roost in the coming year. Without much further ado, I am delighted to give the floor to Daniel Gros for his research, his perspectives, and hopefully some direction to us all when it comes to policy directions. Also, do remember we'll be taking questions for Daniel towards the end of his keynote. So please do keep plugging them into our Q&A section of this conversation. Daniel, without much ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maitri, for this introduction, and many thanks also to EconPol and Clemens for giving me the occasion to speak today to you. It's a great honor to follow Olivier Blanchard and the very distinguished panel which you had earlier. As you already said, the different points of views on how one should look at fiscal policy and the dangers of high public debt levels. And I will probably present you the less positive side, the more cautious side, which usually in my experience turns out to be less popular. But let us see whether I can bring some arguments that have an impact on the debate. So let me try to share my screen with you. I hope you can all see it now. And let me go immediately into the main argument. And here I have okay, sorry. The starting point is very similar to what Olivier Blanchard said this morning. Namely, we have very high debt levels throughout the developed world. Clemens Fuß also mentioned some of the highest numbers, 160% for Italy, 130% for the US, and over 200% of GDP for Greece. And the underlying issue, which was discussed earlier today, was whether it still makes sense to talk about the sustainability of debt if the interest rate is smaller than the growth rate. Right? The famous question, R minus G. And Olivier earlier this morning talked a lot about how one should look at the economics of public finance when that is the case. And he talked a lot of what he called the first moment, meaning the averages and how things look in terms of sustainability going forward. Now, my point is different. I would like to combine two aspects of public debt which have not been taken into account in the debate, has not been taken into account sufficiently in the debate. And these two aspects are very simply that the cost of debt is what's called convex technically, which means that if you double your public debt, its cost probably more than doubles. And you have to combine that with the fact that there is uncertainty. There's uncertainty about growth and about the state of financial markets. And this means that the cost of public debt tomorrow can be very different from what it was today. These are the two basic elements of my talk, which I would really like to keep in mind. But before I go into the specific aspects which I would like to emphasize, I would also like you to consider the historical experience. Because it is not the first time in history that we have seen interest rates lower than the growth rate. Actually, if you look at the work for Schulerick and others on historical growth rates and interest rates, you see that this has been quite frequent. So it is in that sense not totally new. But the historical experience also shows that even when you had periods of low interest rates relative to growth rates, you had actually many government defaults. Actually, if you look at the paper by Mauro in 2019, you can see that the defaults were as frequent during periods of low interest rates relative to the growth rate than others. So you must have something else. Something else is basically very high primary deficits, so similar to today, in combination with high debt accumulation. So his conclusion then was actually that one cannot sleep soundly even if R is smaller than G. So keep that in mind as the historical experience. And perhaps when you look at my own arguments, you see that what might have caused this problem. On the R minus G, we see that this has been a trend over the last years. Olivier showed that this morning. Let me just add one footnote to that in this graph where you see the difference between the interest rate and the growth rate. As a parenthesis, I usually take both nominal, so the nominal interest rate versus the nominal growth rate. If you take both in real terms, it doesn't really matter. And as he showed also, there's a broad trend from the 1990s downwards. And since 2016, for the US, for the euro area and Japan, the growth rate has been higher than the interest rate, so all good. But you also see that if you have a crisis, then suddenly it can spike. Because during the crisis, usually interest rates go up a little bit and the growth rate tanks, meaning that the growth rate factor can spike very suddenly. So keep that in mind. This is the first indication of uncertainty can change the best well laid out plans for debt sustainability. And then let me add one further issue, which is very important, which I don't have time to discuss today in depth, but which is very important. Because the way the public debt, especially public debt crisis, affect the economy depends crucially on who holds that debt. If, like in Japan, most of your debt is held by domestic residents, then it's not net debt at the level of society, of the overall country. And therefore, if you have such a situation and you have a higher risk premium, then the government needs to pay out more. But it pays out to domestic residents who then spend more and pay more taxes. And in the end, it remains within the domestic system. If you owe your debt to foreigners, it's very different. The country as a whole then has to pay to foreigners higher interest if the risk premium goes up. And that is something which is taken out of the entire economy of the country, meaning that in the end, the country is poorer and the government has to finance the debt service from a lower GDP. So this means that a foreign debt is much more of a risk than domestic debt. Now, what does it mean for the euro area concretely? Given that we have a very large cross-border holdings of debt, a large part, perhaps more than 50–60%, is really foreign debt. So this means that if for any euro area country the risk premium goes up, then the problem is for the country, not just a transfer within the country. So keep that in mind. Now, let me just say something about the cost of public debt. So usually it is the interest rate. Olivier Clochard called it the risk-free rate, but it's not really the risk-free rate because most countries also pay a risk premium. So it's a risk-free rate plus a risk premium. And now, where does this risk premium come from? It comes from two elements. You have a risk aversion in the market, and that means the way the market punishes or reacts to high debt ratios. So, and if that's the case, and empirically we can show that has been the case throughout the last 20 years within the euro area, but also with the risk premium or the risk aversion going up and down over time. But what it really implies is this, this equation here, which says that then the total debt service burden is the interest rate times the debt level, right? And that in turn means the interest rate, risk-free rate on the debt times the risk aversion times the square of the debt. And that's crucial. This means that the total debt service burden for the government increases, of course, linearly when the risk-free rate increases, and that was in all the equations of Blanchard, but it increases more than linearly with the debt level. And technically speaking, the second term is convex. And this has one immediate practical implication, which is that the marginal cost of debt is not equal to the risk-free rate, which you see down here, but it is increasing in the debt level itself. So there's a difference between the marginal cost of debt and the interest rate which you see in the market. So when people say, oh, the government is paying today, let's say 0% in the market, and therefore it should make investments until the yield is 0. That's not quite correct, because the marginal cost of additional government debt is higher than the interest rate, as I showed before. And therefore, especially for governments which are already paying a risk premium, they should think twice about the cost of adding additional debt to the existing one. Because the cost of adding additional debt to a rather high one already is that you do not pay only a higher interest cost on the increased debt level because the risk premium goes up, but also because you pay this higher risk premium on the entire debt. So that is the key lesson from this reality, which is the average cost hides the marginal cost. And you see the marginal cost of debt can be very positive and significant, even if the risk-free rate is below 0. If you take the country for Italy, the risk-free rate, which is the German rate, would be negative. But given its high debt level, Italy pays a risk premium, and adding to that debt increases the risk premium. So here you see, for example, the total debt service as a function of the debt ratio, debt service as a percent of GDP of a government, as a function of the debt to GDP ratio. And you can see that it can go up very quickly if you have a high risk aversion in the market, that's the red line, or of course less quickly if you have a low risk aversion. Today we are more in a situation like the blue line here, meaning that even with very high debt ratios, let's say 160% here like Italy, the debt service burden would still be moderate. But if high risk aversion were to return, and we have seen that it can do so during the financial crisis in about 10 years ago, then the debt service burden for the government can escalate very quickly. So that is something to keep in mind. The first point is that the cost of public debt increases more than proportional with the debt ratio, and the cost of piling on debt to already high one is much higher than the interest rate you see in the market. And of course, that what I would like to combine with my second point, which is that there's a key element here of uncertainty, which is risk aversion. Risk aversion in the market is right now pretty low, but we have seen in the past that that can change very quickly. And the cost of an increase in higher risk aversion is again related to the square of the debt ratio. So it becomes very high very quickly, as also you saw as a difference between increases between the red line and the blue line, which I showed previously. Moreover, when you have a negative shock to growth in the country concerned, that increases the debt ratio, and that probably then leads not only to an impact on the risk-free on the debt service you have to pay via this term here, the square of the debt ratio, but also because maybe at the same time the risk aversion increases in the market. So that means that it is very important to be aware of these elements which are not really captured if we do standard sustainability analysis, and even the sustainability analysis which Olivier Blanchard is proposing does not incorporate these elements. A further element which is important is if you have this dependency of the cost of debt service from the debt ratio, then that can spiral out of control very quickly. And higher debt means that you can have a danger of such a much higher danger of such a negative spiral. And to make just a very simple example, assume that you're in a situation where initially the primary surplus is just not enough to cover debt service. Could be very little. Then the next period debt will be higher, but with a higher debt level, you will also have to pay a higher premium. You will have higher debt service costs, and then the next period after that, your primary surplus will even cover less of the debt service, and therefore you get the spiral where the debt ratio increases ever more quickly. I can show you here a picture where, together with my colleague Cinzia Alcidi, we just did a very similar, very simple simulation for countries where the risk premium depends on the debt to GDP ratio. And we ask ourselves, if you're in a situation where initially you might be between the green line and the lila line here, so you start with a debt ratio which is, let's say, between 130 and 110% of GDP, and you keep your primary surplus constant. You just don't do anything on the primary surplus, right? Then if you're a little bit above that level, that gets out of control. If you're a little bit below, of course, then that converges or declines nicely. So that is another consequence of this dependency of the risk premium on the debt to GDP ratio, which is something which we observe in reality. Right now is very low, but it is a fact of life and something that needs to be taken account also in debt sustainability analysis. But now let me come to another element and corollary of convexity. And that is simply that fat tails matter. What do I mean by fat tails? Fat tails is an expression which says that the distribution of shocks, and there could be either shocks to GDP or shocks to the market risk premium, can have very strong consequences, even catastrophic consequences, when the cost of debt is convex, meaning if it increases more than proportionally with the debt level itself. And that means you have to be very careful with what you think is the probability of extreme events. Because an extreme or very large shock, even if it is has a very low probability, can have an extreme impact. And my simple point is that the history shows that actually distribution of growth rates is very fat-tailed. And let me just illustrate that with one example. There are others one could do, which is again responds a little bit to what Olivier said this morning. It responds to the question, how likely is it that you have shocks which are, technically speaking, 1 or 2 or 3 standard deviations away from the mean? And here I have given you the actual measured growth rates of advanced economies over the last couple of 100 years. which you can get from a historical database. And then I've asked myself, how much more of these extreme values do you observe relative to a theoretical distribution, which is the normal one, which use most people, and which most people, by the way, also use in stochastic sustainability analysis. And what you can see here is in the center, you have values above 1, which means that actually very small shocks are even more probable than suggested by the normal distribution that people or economists mostly use. And then the medium shocks are actually less likely than one would expect from a normal distribution. But then when one gets in so-called tails, left and right, one sees that there are much more. 4 sigma events are basically more than almost 6 times as likely as you would expect from a normal distribution. I should add that I've actually cut off the distribution here because 5 sigma events would be off the chart. They are much more frequent than they should be if the distribution were normal, so to speak. So this means that reality is not a situation where you have normally distributed shocks, which get successively much more unlikely as they become larger. The reality is actually the opposite. You have lots of small shocks, few medium sized, and a lot of tail events, right? And of course, the negative tail is the one which is most important one. Here you see, as I said earlier, 6 times as many 3.5 sigma events. 4 sigma events are more than 15 times as likely in observed frequency as they should be from a normal distribution. So that brings me to my conclusions. And the first one is very clear. If we just look at the debt service burden today, R minus G today, that is not a useful way to look at what level of public debt should be considered prudent. And that is because the cost of public debt is likely to increase more than proportionally with the debt ratio, which has one immediate practical implication, which is not about sustainability, but that the marginal cost of debt is actually higher than the interest rate you can observe in the market. And that should be obvious but it's never taken into account by policymakers. And the final point is that you should take into account the fat tails. I think this crisis has shown us that the unexpected materializes more often than we would like. And even a small likelihood of extreme events needs to be taken into account because the cost of such an event would be catastrophic. So that is, if you want, the prudent person rule, which Nicholas Taleb has summarized in his own words as a mathematician of uncertainty much better. We really should not confront normal idiosyncratic shocks which happen here and there with other ones which are, in his words, multiplicative, systemic, and fat-tailed. Let me conclude here.